Young doctor performed hemorrhoid surgery on a comatose female. Millionaire. Shockingly, she wakes up and love finds them. The ER was unusually quiet for a Friday night, but the silence didn't last long. The emergency doors swung open with force as paramedics rushed in a stretcher. Blood was seeping through the linens, and the patient, a woman in her early 30s, was unconscious, her breathing shallow. The trauma nurse quickly called out vitals. BP is dropping fast, internal bleeding suspected, rectal hemorrhage, severe. Dr. Byrne Hayes arrived just as the gurney was wheeled into OR prep. He was young, barely 30, but already known for his meticulous work and his willingness to take cases others avoided. His white coat bore signs of a long shift, but his eyes were sharp. "What do we know?" he asked, pulling on gloves. "Unknown identity. No ID. Possible complication from an outpatient hemorrhoid procedure," the nurse replied. "She collapsed at her home. The maid called it in." Another doctor approached Byrne, speaking low. "You don't want this one, Hayes," he warned. "Trust me. This isn't just any Jane Doe. Rumor is she's high profile. If this goes south, it's your career." Byrne didn't blink. He looked at the woman, pale, unconscious, alone. "I'm a doctor," he said calmly. "I don't get to choose the easy cases." And just like that, he nodded to the team. "We're going in." Inside the OR, tension mounted immediately. The bleeding was worse than anticipated. The rectal tissues had been severely compromised, possibly due to a botched laser treatment and infection. Her blood pressure plummeted. "BP 78/42. She's crashing," a nurse called. Byrne worked quickly, his hands steady despite the chaos. He clamped vessels, flushed infected tissue, and stabilized her lower colon. The team watched in awe as he moved with precision, adjusting techniques mid-procedure to adapt to her body's fragile state. "She's fibrillating," the anesthesiologist shouted. Byrne's voice didn't rise. 1 milligram epi. Now. They administered the shot. After a harrowing pause, her heart rhythm returned to normal. Weak but steady. 3 hours later, the surgery ended. The bleeding had stopped. The internal damage had been repaired as best as possible, but Danielle Royce didn't wake up. Her body lay still in the recovery room, hooked up to monitors that beeped with an eerie rhythm. "She's in a coma," the neurologist whispered after scans showed no immediate cause. "Could be trauma-induced, or a reaction to anesthesia. We don't know yet." Within the hour, the hospital director called an emergency meeting. Byrne stood before a panel of stern faces in a cold conference room. "You performed a high-risk emergency surgery on an unidentified female with no consent," one board member snapped. "She would have died," Byrne replied, exhausted but firm. "And now she might never wake up," another said sharply. A file was slammed on the table. "Do you know who this woman is?" Byrne shook his head. "Danielle Royce, founder and CEO of Royce Properties, net worth in the hundreds of millions. This hospital could face a lawsuit that would bury us." Byrne exhaled slowly. "I treated a human being, not a headline." "She has a legal team already en route," someone muttered. "And if she doesn't wake up," another asked, "are you prepared to face a malpractice suit?" "I did what I had to do," Byrne answered, "and I'd do it again." Outside, nurses whispered. Word spread quickly. The young doctor who took on the unwinnable case had possibly ruined his future. But Byrne didn't flinch. That night, after his shift ended, he walked back to the ICU. No visitors had come, no family, just a silent room filled with the rhythmic hum of machines. He stood beside Danielle's bed and looked at her pale, motionless face. "I don't know who you are," he said quietly, "but I'm sorry this happened to you, and I'm not going anywhere." He pulled up a chair and sat. That night, he didn't read charts or think about lawsuits. He opened a worn book of poetry from his coat pocket and began to read aloud. And for the first time since the surgery, the room didn't feel cold anymore. The ICU was always quiet at night, dimly lit and filled with the soft hum of machines and the occasional rhythmic beep of monitors. Most visitors came and went during the day, but Byrne came when his shift ended. Long after the halls had emptied, when the only sounds were the breathing of the patients and the soft shuffle of tired nurses. He walked to room 306 like it was a part of his daily ritual now. Danielle Royce lay there, motionless. Her long dark hair was brushed neatly, her face pale but peaceful. She was still in a coma, but her vitals were stable. The hospital board continued to watch the case closely. Byrne had been called in twice more to explain his decisions. The message was clear: keep your head down, avoid further risk, and don't get personally involved. But Byrne couldn't. He began each visit by sanitizing his hands and checking her chart. He wasn't her official attending physician anymore, but he knew the nurses didn't mind. In fact, some had begun to help him. Quietly, Nurse Leela, who worked the night shift, had noticed early on. "You know she probably can't hear you," she said softly one night, handing him a clean cloth to wipe Danielle's forehead. "I know," Byrne replied, gently dabbing her skin. "But just in case she can, I want her to hear something worth waking up to." And so, every night, he talked to her. At first, it was simple things: updates on her condition, a summary of the weather, stories from the ward. But soon, he found himself telling her about his own life. He told her about his childhood in a small town, how his mother used to work double shifts as a waitress just to put food on the table, how she died of a preventable heart condition when he was 17 because they couldn't afford her medications. "She was strong," he whispered to Danielle, sitting beside her bed. "But she didn't have someone like me back then. That's why I became a doctor. I couldn't save her, but maybe I can save someone else." Sometimes he read to her. Poetry, classic novels, articles about medical breakthroughs. One night he read from a worn copy of The Little Prince. "It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye," he quoted, glancing up at her face. "You're probably rolling your eyes right now. But I think you'd like that line." Every night he adjusted her blankets, massaged her hands to prevent stiffness, made sure her lips weren't chapped. He brought small comforts: lavender oil for her pillow, soft music through a small speaker, even a plush blanket in a deep wine color. Something warm, something beautiful. One evening, Nurse Leila caught him smoothing her hair with gentle fingers. "You're more than just her surgeon now, aren't you?" she asked quietly. Byrne looked down, unsure how to answer. "She's not just a patient anymore," he admitted. "I don't know when it changed. I look at her, and I don't see status or headlines. I see someone who's fighting for her life, and I guess I don't want her to fight alone." Lila smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "You'd be surprised how often people wake up, not because of medicine, but because someone kept talking to them. Someone stayed." The hospital administration didn't like the attention Byrne's involvement was drawing. There were whispers about conflict of interest, about emotional entanglement, but no one told him to stop. Maybe because deep down they saw it too, the quiet hope that had begun to bloom in room 36. And for Byrne, the hospital had never felt more sacred than when he was there beside her. With Danielle, he didn't feel like just a doctor. He felt like a man holding on to something fragile and real, something he hadn't realized he'd been missing all this time. A connection that had no name, no expectations, no timeline, just presence. One night, after he finished reading a few pages from a memoir, he set the book down and leaned in closer to her. "I don't know if you can hear me," he whispered, "but I'll keep coming back until you open your eyes, and even after that. I'll be here." And in the silence that followed, something shifted, not in the machines, not in her vitals, but in the air itself. Something was changing. He didn't know what yet, but his heart did. Danielle Royce had been born into the kind of wealth that made people forget she was human. Her childhood was a blur of nannies, elite boarding schools, and private jets. Her parents, powerful real estate moguls, had been more familiar with stock portfolios than bedtime stories. She grew up in mansions too large to feel like home, with dinners too formal to feel like family. By the time she was 25, both her parents were gone, taken suddenly in a plane crash en route to a business deal in Dubai. The media devoured the tragedy for weeks. "Heiress to Royce Empire orphaned overnight," the headlines read. But no one asked how she was holding up. No one thought to. She buried them with grace, wearing black designer sunglasses and a face untouched by grief, because showing pain was weakness. That was something her father had taught her, perhaps unintentionally, with every emotion he had buried in silence. After that, Danielle stepped fully into the role she was born for, CEO of Royce Properties. She made bold moves, turned failing assets into gold, and earned a reputation as a business prodigy. Investors admired her, competitors feared her, tabloids obsessed over her. But no one really knew her, except perhaps for Judith. Judith had been her mother's personal assistant and became Danielle's by default, but over the years she became more than that. She became family. She was the only one who called Danielle on her birthday with genuine warmth, who reminded her to eat, who saw beyond the sharp suits and steely eyes. Danielle let her in, just enough. But even Judith couldn't save her from Nathan. Nathan had been charming, brilliant, and attentive. He said all the right things. He seemed to understand her loneliness, her walls, her need to be seen beyond her last name. For a year, she let herself believe she could be loved, until she discovered that Nathan had been hired, paid by a rival company to get close, gain her trust, and sabotage a key acquisition deal. He had played the long game, right down to the engagement ring. Danielle had fired him from her life the same way she closed a deal, quietly, ruthlessly, without a tear shed in public. But inside, something shattered. After that, she turned inward. She stopped attending galas, gave terse interviews, tightened her inner circle to the size of a pinhole, and she began to change her appearance. Small things at first. A rhinoplasty here, skin tightening there, lip enhancements. Tiny corrections to match the image she thought the world would finally accept. Perfection. But perfection was a moving target, and eventually it broke her body. The day she collapsed, she had just returned from a second round of an innovative cosmetic procedure recommended by a high-end clinic. She felt faint, nauseous, but told herself it was normal. She woke up in an ambulance. And then, nothing. Darkness. Yet, within that darkness, something stirred. At first, she thought it was a dream, a voice, soft and steady, reciting lines she vaguely remembered from childhood books, a warmth near her hand, the faint scent of lavender, then more voices, one in particular, a man's. Calm, deep, thoughtful. He talked about his mother, about losing her, about fighting for others because he couldn't save her. He read to her, asked her questions, joked about hospital food, shared frustrations from his day. He even told her how he missed sunsets because he worked too late. And for the first time in what felt like years, Danielle felt something that wasn't fear or anger. She felt safe. She wanted to speak, to open her eyes, to ask him, "Why are you here?" But her body wouldn't listen. Still, she waited for that voice. She counted the minutes until it returned. Sometimes he played soft music, classical pieces that reminded her of her mother's piano. Sometimes he sang, off-key but sincere. Once he apologized for being late, and it made her heart ache. She had no idea who he was, but whoever he was, he made the silence less unbearable. And somewhere deep inside her fractured consciousness, a piece of Danielle Royce, the girl beneath the empire, began to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone could care for her without wanting anything in return. Even if she never woke up to tell him so. The beeping changed first. It had been steady for weeks, just enough to confirm life, just distant enough to feel like loss. But that morning the rhythm shifted. A flicker, a tremble, then movement. Danielle's fingers twitched. Nurse Leela was the first to see it. She rushed to the side of the bed, calling for a doctor. As Danielle's eyelids fluttered, her breath shallow and uneven, the room transformed. For the first time in 24 days, hope flooded into room 306. She blinked against the sterile white lights overhead, her vision blurred, her limbs heavy as stone. The pain came slowly, dull and distant, but real. She tried to speak, but only a rasp escaped her throat. "You're okay," Lila whispered gently, tears in her eyes. "You're back." Danielle turned her head slightly, her voice faint. "How long?" 3 weeks and 3 days, the nurse replied. You've been in a coma, but you're stable now. You're going to be okay. Danielle let the words settle into her mind. A coma. Everything felt dreamlike and distant, except one thing. A man, she murmured. Someone was reading to me? Lila's eyes widened. You remember that? Danielle nodded slowly. I couldn't move, but I heard him, his voice. He read poetry about trust. The nurse smiled. That would be Dr. Hayes. Byrne. He came every night, sat with you, talked to you. Danielle closed her eyes for a moment. So he was real. The voice that had softened the edges of her unconscious mind belonged to someone who'd stayed when he didn't have to. Later that afternoon, Byrne entered the ICU, unaware of the change in status. He was carrying a small poetry book and a thermos of herbal tea, his usual gifts to the silence. He nearly dropped both when he saw her eyes open. Danielle looked at him. Really looked. It took her a few seconds. The face didn't match the voice in her dreams, not exactly, but the moment he spoke, her breath caught. It's good to see you awake, he said softly. Her eyes didn't leave his. It's you, she whispered. You're the one who stayed. Byrne gave a small, almost bashful nod. I thought you might need someone, he said, someone who didn't walk away. Danielle's lips trembled. She wasn't used to being caught off guard, not in business, not in life, but this moment felt fragile, pure. Why? She asked, her voice hoarse. You didn't know me. I didn't have to, he replied. You were alone, that was enough. Silence hung between them, not awkward but charged, full of everything unsaid. I remember your voice, she said after a while. It was the only thing that made the dark feel less terrifying. Byrne pulled the chair closer to her bedside and sat, not too close, but close enough for her to feel him there. I didn't know if you could hear me, he admitted, but I hoped. Danielle's eyes glistened. She wasn't sure if it was the medication, the weakness, or simply the fact that someone had cared, deeply, consistently, without expectation. For a long moment they sat there, eyes locked, no more words needed. This wasn't the reunion of lovers. This was something more subtle, a seed being planted, a truth being shared. That night, as the hospital settled into quiet, Danielle rested with her eyes half closed, Byrne still by her side. And for the first time in her adult life, she didn't feel like she had to be strong or smart or beautiful. She just had to be, and he was there. Danielle's recovery moved steadily once she was transferred from the ICU. Her body, though still fragile, responded well to treatment and physical therapy. Her mind, however, was far more complex. 3 days after waking, she made a request to the hospital administrator. I want Dr. Hayes assigned as my post-separative physician, she said clearly, exclusively. The administrator hesitated. Miss Royce, typically attending physicians rotate. Make an exception, she interrupted. You'll be compensated. The next day, Byrne was called into a meeting and presented with the request. He frowned. I don't accept special treatment. She's asking for you not because of your name, the administrator said, but because she trusts you. And trust, for someone like her, doesn't come easy, Byrne agreed. With conditions, no special payment, no luxury perks, just a promise. He would be her doctor as long as she was still his patient. Nothing more. But things weren't that simple. Danielle moved to a private rehab suite in her own residence, high-ceilinged, minimalist, overlooking the city skyline. Byrne visited daily for physical assessments, wound checks, and scheduled therapy. But somewhere between checking vitals and adjusting her medications, their conversations expanded. They talked about books, films, childhoods. He told her how he used to sneak into the local library and read for hours because he couldn't afford to buy novels. She told him how, as a child, she'd hide in her mother's closet just to feel safe from the world outside. Every night after his clinical responsibilities, she'd invite him to stay for tea. I don't entertain guests, she said one evening, but somehow I don't feel like you're a guest. He smiled. And yet, I always bring the same tea. You're consistent, she said softly. That's rare. Danielle found herself drawn to him. Not just his calm voice or gentle touch, but the way he looked at her, not at her wealth, her title, her past. Just her. And that frightened her more than she cared to admit. Byrne, for his part, noticed the change in her too, the vulnerability in her questions, the softness in her silence. He began to memorize her routines, the way she curled her fingers around the mug before drinking, how she hummed softly when lost in thought. He cared, deeply, but he reminded himself daily he was still her doctor. One night they sat side by side on the terrace. The city lights glimmered beneath them, the air crisp. "You're quiet tonight," she said. "I was just thinking," he replied. "About boundaries." Danielle turned to look at him. "You mean between doctor and patient?" He nodded. "You're getting stronger every day. Soon you won't need me in that role anymore." "What if I do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Byrne didn't answer right away. Then, gently, he said, "You don't need a doctor, Danielle. You need someone who sees you, and right now, that can't be me." The space between them seemed to stretch. Though physically nothing had changed, she tried to laugh it off. "So formal. You're worried you'll lose your license if you stay for one more cup of tea?" But it wasn't about tea, and they both knew it. When she touched his hand, just briefly, and said, "You could stay the night, just to talk," he met her eyes and shook his head. "I care about you too much to blur the line." Danielle said nothing, only nodded, but inside something cracked. All her life men had pursued her for what she had, her beauty, her power, her fortune. But Byrne didn't want any of that, and for the first time she wasn't sure she was enough. Not as Danielle Royce, the millionaire, but as Danielle the woman still learning how to be loved. The evening was quiet, but a different kind of quiet. The kind that settled into the walls, thick and waiting. Danielle sat curled up in an oversized chair, wearing a soft gray sweater, her long legs tucked under her. A fire crackled in the stone hearth beside her, casting flickers of gold across the room. Byrne sat across from her, his cup of tea untouched. Danielle had been different all day, distant, contemplative. Now, as the shadows deepened and the silence stretched, she finally looked at him. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." She stared into the fire for a long moment before speaking. "When I was 8, she began, my father left. No note, no goodbye, just a wire transfer and silence. My mother tried to cover for him, said he was traveling, said he'd call. But I knew. I always knew." Byrne said nothing, only watched her face. Danielle continued, "At 13, I overheard a teacher say I was too cold to ever be loved properly. At 15, I started changing how I looked. Diets, facials, perfect posture. By 18, I'd had my first cosmetic procedure." She touched her cheek absent-mindedly, as if remembering all the ways she had tried to reshape herself. "My college boyfriend dumped me the day after my mother died, said I was too broken. And Nathan, the one everyone knows about, he only loved my net worth. He had a whole plan. Get close, earn trust, propose, take half." She paused, her voice lower now. "So when people look at me, Byrne, they see money, power, control, maybe beauty if the lights hit right, but they don't see me. They never ask why I stay up all night reading medical journals, or why I cry when I see elderly couples holding hands." Her eyes met his, sharp and searching. "So I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest." Byrne leaned forward. "Ask." "If I weren't Danielle Royce," she whispered, "if I had nothing, no money, no house, no name, and if I didn't look like this, would you still have stayed?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Byrne looked at her, really looked, at the guarded way she held herself, at the pain barely hidden beneath the surface, at the strength it took to even ask. He set down his tea. "I stayed," he said quietly. "When you were unconscious, pale, with tubes in your arms and no name on your chart. I stayed when no one else came, when you weren't talking, smiling, or even aware of me." He paused. "I stayed when the only thing you had was a heartbeat, and I would do it all again." Danielle inhaled sharply, but the tears came before she could speak. Not delicate tears, not the kind you dab away with a silk handkerchief. These were raw, uncontrollable sobs, like a storm that had waited years to break. Byrne moved to her side, slowly, giving her space, but she reached out first. She clung to him like an anchor, her face buried in his chest, her shoulders shaking. He held her, not to fix her, not to save her, just to be there. She cried for the little girl who had waited at the window for her father, for the teenager who thought thinness would buy affection, for the woman who had built a kingdom only to realize she was the queen of a very lonely castle. And when the storm passed, she looked up, eyes red and wet. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what?" he asked, brushing a tear from her cheek. "For not believing someone like you could exist." Byrne smiled, his voice soft. "I'm not perfect, Danielle. I've got a lifetime of scars too. But I see you, and I care. Not for what you are, but for who you are." She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. It wasn't a confession of love, not yet, but it was something just as rare: trust. The morning air was still, heavy with an early drizzle. Soft raindrops tapped against the windows of Danielle's estate, blurring the view of the manicured gardens outside. Inside, something else was beginning to blur: lines, roles, emotions. Danielle had grown used to Byrne's presence, the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the warmth of his voice during checkups, the quiet companionship over late-night tea. But that morning she woke to silence. No footsteps, no knock at her door, just an envelope. It lay on the kitchen table, beneath her favorite ceramic mug. Her name was written across it in neat, familiar handwriting. She opened it slowly, her breath catching in her throat. "Danielle, I never meant for it to become this complicated. When I first stayed by your bedside, I did it because no one else did. And as the days passed, I stopped seeing you as a patient, and started seeing you as a person, then as something more. But being both your doctor and someone who cares for you this deeply, it's a line I can't cross and still be the man I want to be. So I'm stepping away from my role, not because I want distance, but because I want to be honest. I don't want to be your physician anymore. I want to be the man who stands beside you, not in duty, but in love. And I'll wait, if that's what it takes. But I can't stay like this." Danielle read it 3 times before the words truly landed. Her hands trembled. For years she had been abandoned, betrayed, used. But this was different. Byrne wasn't walking away to protect himself. He was walking away to protect them. The drizzle outside had turned to a soft rain, painting the stone steps of the front terrace in a silvery sheen. Danielle didn't hesitate. She threw on a long coat over her nightclothes and ran barefoot down the marble hallway. She pushed open the front doors just as Byrne reached the gate. "Byrne!" she called, her voice sharp, cutting through the rain. He turned, surprised, his bag slung over his shoulder. Danielle stepped out into the rain, her hair quickly soaking, her breath visible in the cool air. "You forgot something," she said, holding up the letter. He walked toward her slowly. "No, I didn't." She shook her head, tears mixing with rain. "You can stop being my doctor," she said. "You can even stop coming to this house." She paused, her voice breaking. "But don't leave my heart." Byrne froze, the words sinking in like warmth through soaked clothes. "I thought I had to be whole to deserve someone like you," she whispered. "But maybe love isn't about being perfect. Maybe it's about choosing someone, even when it's messy, even when it's terrifying." He stepped closer. "I never wanted you to be perfect, Danielle. I just wanted you to be real." She laughed softly through her tears. "Well, here I am. Real, ruined mascara, rain in my shoes." And then, without another word, she reached for him. Byrne dropped his bag. They collided in an embrace that was part relief, part apology, and wholly unconditional. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, as if to anchor them both. Neither cared about the rain anymore. They stood like that for minutes. No words, no plans. Just the quiet truth that love had found them, not in perfection, but in presence. 1 year later, on a crisp, sunlit morning, a small crowd gathered outside a brick building on the quieter edge of the city. The windows were clean, the garden freshly planted with lavender and rosemary, and a modest wooden sign hung proudly above the glass doors. Where healing isn't just for the body, but for the heart. It had been Danielle's idea, but the name was Burns. They had spoken about it on one of their long walks through the city, hands intertwined, no longer hiding from anything. Second chances, he had said, are rare, but we can give them to others. And now they were. The clinic offered free care to the uninsured, underprivileged, and overlooked. Byrne worked 6 days a week, seeing patients from all walks of life. Single mothers, homeless veterans, elderly immigrants who hadn't seen a doctor in years. He greeted each person with the same patience, the same warmth that had once brought Danielle back from the brink. Danielle, meanwhile, handled the financial side. She'd set up a private endowment, partnered with other philanthropists, and repurposed her name, once a symbol of aloof wealth, into something powerful and generous. She ran motivational workshops in the back room, helped fund mental health support, and always made sure there was fresh coffee and music playing in the waiting area. The clinic wasn't luxurious. It didn't need to be. It was honest, real, alive. Inside, the walls were painted soft tones of cream and sage. In the main hallway, beside a framed photo of the first patient they ever treated, hung a wooden plaque with the words Danielle had personally carved. Healing doesn't begin with medicine. It begins with someone who stays. And below it, in smaller script, where healing isn't just for the body, but for the heart. On opening day, reporters had come, though not in overwhelming numbers. The local community was more interested than the tabloids. There were no red carpets, just folding chairs, heartfelt speeches, and donated cupcakes. Danielle stood at the podium, wearing a simple white blouse and navy skirt, her hair tied back. She looked out at the small crowd, neighbors, patients, nurses, and a few friends from her past who were still stunned at the transformation. She took a breath. "I used to believe love was a transaction," she began, "that people stayed only when they had something to gain, that no one would choose you, just you, if you had nothing left to give." She paused, her eyes finding Byrne in the front row. "A year ago, I was in a coma, alone, after a string of bad choices and worse judgments. I don't remember the exact moment things began to shift, but I remember the voice." Her smile trembled. "A man who read poetry to me when I couldn't speak, who told me stories when I couldn't respond, who chose to stay when no one else did." She stepped back slightly from the mic. "Byrne Hayes didn't save me because I was rich. He didn't care about my name or my past. He stayed because he saw a woman who needed someone to believe in her." She let the words sit, soft and strong. "And that belief gave me the courage to become someone worth staying for." The room went quiet. Byrne stood slowly, walking up beside her. He didn't take the mic. He simply took her hand and looked into her eyes. "And I'm still that man," he said gently. "Not because she's Danielle Royce, the millionaire, but because she's Danielle, the woman who taught me that healing isn't a science." He turned to the room. "It's an act of love." The crowd applauded, some wiping their eyes, others holding their loved ones a little tighter. Later that afternoon, as the clinic doors opened to their first patients, Danielle and Byrne stood side by side, greeting each visitor with a smile. They moved together seamlessly, partners in purpose, in work, and in life. Outside, the lavender swayed in the breeze. Inside, a child's laughter echoed through the hall. And in the center of it all, beneath the plaque, two people stood who had once been broken. But now they were whole, because they had found each other, not in perfection, but in healing, together. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with flowers or fireworks. Sometimes it comes quietly, through whispered words in a hospital room, through hands that don't let go when the world does, through a choice to stay even when no one's watching. Danielle and Byrne didn't fall in love in the usual way. They found it in silence, in scars, and in second chances, because true healing isn't just about saving lives. It's about reminding someone that they're worth saving, and maybe that's what love truly is. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and subscribe to Soul Stirring Stories. where every story is a reminder that hope, love, and kindness still live in this world. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss a story that stirs your soul. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes being there is the greatest gift of all.